with these men. So,
in the foreword to A Truth Universally Acknowledged, 33 Reasons Why We Can't Stop Reading Jane Austen, Harold Bloom says that Austen is immortal because we behold and confront our own anguish and fantasies in her novels. I would go further than this and say that Austen is immortal because we keep meeting her characters in our own lives and often find ourselves having relationships with them. Austen provides a framework for negotiating relationships that is as recognisable now as it was 200 years ago. I have called this talk Austen's Men because her characters are situated in a strictly heteronormative context as was suitable for publication in her time. But while her men and women have only gendered options in their behaviours, I don't necessarily think their personalities or types are restricted by their gender. Hence, regardless of our own gender as readers or our sexual preferences, in Austen we all find familiar characters with whom we interact and try and establish relationships in the real world. At the top of the list, Mr. Darcy is the basis for more failed relationships than I personally care to reflect upon. The idea of the silent, scornful type who secretly nurses an incurable passion is one that is immortalised in fiction and that too often spills over into real life. This trope has been documented and investigated by sociologists as one that leads women at one extreme to read Mills and Boon novels and at the other to endure abusive and dangerous relationships. Unlike Mr. Darcy, some real people are not nursing an unspoken passion. They actually are scornful and uninterested. Mr. Darcy has no trouble expressing himself with incredible rudeness when he first meets Elizabeth Bennet, but is apparently unable to express his affection subsequently. She is aware, even after they are engaged, that he had yet to be learned to be laughed at and it was rather too early to begin, and that she must tread cautiously in their interactions. Even when her spirits have risen again to playfulness, obviously he has depressed them, she is still careful with him. He explains his earlier silence by saying that a man who had felt less might have spoken more. Elizabeth, newly in love, allows this to be a reasonable answer, and in a book it may well be. But women have internalised this idea as a reasonable one to an extent that does not serve them well. A man who does not speak to us of how he feels may not be doing so because he feels too much to express. Surely it is much more likely that either he feels nothing worth expressing or he does not think it worth his while to explain himself more fully. Either way, this does not bode well for the future of any relationship, and Elizabeth's sensitivity to Darcy's feelings does not seem to be matched by any sensitivity of his for hers. Wickham too is a familiar type of man to those of us with some worldly experience. He preys upon trusting women, preferring the naive, and rouses female protective instincts with his tales of victimisation bravely risen above. Like Willoughby, Wickham is a sexual predator, interested in the conquest but keeping his options open for the most profitable alliance to be had. And we are wrong if we dismiss Austen's concerns about money as confining her to the 18th century, while her characters are openly concerned about the financial prospect of their prospective mate. We too are concerned with concepts such as sexually transmitted debt and with the earning and employment prospects of the person with whom we intend to cast our lot. Wickham may be caught by his sexual and social indiscretion with Lydia Bennet, but he still manages to extract a reasonable price for his matrimonial compliance. Willoughby escapes the direct consequences of his affair with Eliza, and this too is a common enough occurrence even in modern times. And his excuses for seducing and abandoning her are now tired from long centuries of repetition. It was her idea. I didn't know she was pregnant, young, friendless, disgraced. She could have found me if she'd tried. He could easily add she was dressed provocatively. But even with the variations on these excuses that he makes to Eleanor, he learns nothing, and he still sacrifices love for profit and marriage with Miss Grey. Austen observes wryly that his own enjoyment or his own ease was in every particular his ruling principle. This selfish scenario can still be true today. It may manifest in less obvious ways than deliberately marrying for money, although tabloids are quick to cry gold digger. But it is displayed commonly enough in people who work long hours to the neglect of their relationships or families, putting money above love in that sense. And Willoughby does, as Sarah mentioned, go on to frequently enjoy himself and to devote most of his life to his work of horses, dogs and sporting of every kind, and so to find no inconsiderable degree of domestic felicity. So he is an ordinary man, concerned only for his own comfort, who finds himself married to financial advantage to someone he doesn't really care about, and who makes the best of it by largely ignoring his mate and pursuing his own interests. Colonel Brandon, from Sense and Sensibility as well, is another recognisable type. He suffers from the same syndrome that afflicts men like Rod Stewart and Donald Trump. Hang on! They can only love one kind of woman, and they keep marrying younger and younger versions of her. Brandon seems to fall in love with Marianne Dashwood at first sight. He knows nothing about her except she plays the piano and is the poor relation of Sir John Middleton. But as he says later, she reminds him of another young woman. He does not know Marianne as well as he knew Eliza, so it can only be the physical resemblance that reminds him. So much is he enamoured of the idea that Marianne is Eliza that he does nothing when it seems they will share the same fate, even when he is in a position to save Marianne. He cautions Eleanor against educating her sister because he would prefer her to remain like his Eliza, even at the risk that Marianne too may be disgraced. Brandon's voyeurism is unforgivable. He seems to be bewitched by the spectacle of Marianne almost dying from unrequited love of a man he knows very well to be a scoundrel. In spite of Austen's explanations, I can see no credible reason for Brandon not to speak up. His delicacy may forbid him from speaking to Marianne or even Eleanor, but what stops him from speaking to Mrs. Dashwood or Sir John or even to Willoughby himself? He has been to war. He is a man of action. It's not credible that he would be afraid in this situation, so it must satisfy some other psychological need to remain silent. Perhaps his need to recreate the first woman he loved in a young girl who resembles her, even down to recreating her death. From the same novel, Edward Ferrars is another type of man we may all have met, under the thumb of his family, unable to stand up for himself, in a relationship that he has no idea how to extricate himself from, and yet appealingly helpless and seeming just to need the right woman to save him. What does Eleanor Dashwood see in him? Entering into the secret engagement with Lucy Steele may be the understandable mistake of a very young man, but continuing with it rather than trying to make his own living or just facing the music with his mother shows him to be weak and deceitful. Was there ever a more self-serving bunch of excuses than the ones he offers to poor Eleanor? He bemoans his lack of employment and seems to understand that it's the cause of all his problems, and yet does nothing about it until the living of Delaford is offered to him on a plate. At the end of the novel, when Marianne decides that she is an adult, we know Eleanor is simply replacing her with another child in Edward. Henry Crawford from Mansfield Park is another modern type of man. Enabled by his sisters, he pursues women he is not actually interested in to satisfy his own vanity. What he likes is to wreak havoc, to set the Bertram sisters against each other, and to break Mariah's engagement to Mr. Rushworth just because he can, not because he wants to marry Mariah himself. It validates his idea of his own power and importance and makes him feel invincible. When he sets his sights on Fanny, He only wants her to look kindly on me, to give me smiles as well as blushes, to keep a chair for me by herself wherever we are, be all animation when I take it and talk to her, to think as I think, be interested in all my possessions and pleasures, try to keep me longer at Mansfield, and feel when I go away she shall never be happy again. It's modest enough. He sees other people as playthings, as amusements for an idle hour or day or week, and by extension his sister Mary Crawford is just as bad. She sees nothing wrong with his games, does nothing to protect the women who she claims are her friends, and what she enjoys most about her relationship with Edmund is that she could get his sturdy spirit to bend. Oh, it was sweet beyond expression. The psychopathology checklist is the tool currently used to diagnose serious personality disorders. It uses phrases such as callous unconcern for the feelings of others, glibness, superficial charm and insincerity, pathologic egocentricity and incapacity for love, and a failure to follow any life plan, to describe a diagnosis of dissocial personality disorder. This seems very apt for the Crawfords, and particularly for Henry. Mary shares some of these traits, but we don't see them displayed as openly. Perhaps Austen's men just have more opportunities to display their sociopathic tendencies than her women do. At first glance, it would seem that Captain Benwick is a true romantic of the kind not often met with in the 21st century. He is showing signs of being willing to die for his lost love, Fanny Harville, in Persuasion. He has taken up residence with his deceased fiancée's family, reads only the most depressive poetry, and wallows in his despair for his dead love. These things are terribly romantic and slightly dangerous, and he is gently chastised for them by Anne Elliot. But it turns out that he is able to be comforted, and quickly forgets Fanny in the arms of Louisa Musgrove. Captain Harville laments that poor Fanny would not have forgotten him so soon, and labels Benwick inconstant. Anne argues that it is man's nature that has done the business of forgetting from Benwick. And it's true that Benwick's recovery is very familiar, and very contrary to how he saw himself just a few chapters earlier as struggling against affliction. The prompt remarriage of well-known men such as Paul McCartney and Glenn McGrath after the death of a dearly loved partner is persistent enough to warrant sociological analysis of its own. Mary Kenny writes, "The widower from Jane Eyre to Jilly Cooper and The Sound of Music has been viewed as an eligible bachelor with the added elan of worldly experience. Captain Benwick is close enough to a widower in Austen's world to be very eligible, and indeed, in the same novel, Sir Walter Elliot pictures himself, a man in his 50s, as a young and handsome bachelor with women pursuing him. And Mrs. Clay is pursuing him, no matter that he is old enough to be her father. It is the pining romantic hero who will never find another partner, who is the unfamiliar figure in both Austen's novels and the real world." Again, in Persuasion, Captain Wentworth is a character who most women would recognise, the sulky baby. Poor Captain Wentworth did not get his own way with Anne Elliot. She had the temerity to reject him, and he has been having a tantrum for 8 years. Although in all that time, all over the world, he has not met another woman he liked so much, he is determined not to forgive her. He fondly thinks this means he is decisive and firm, but all it really means is he's behaving like a spoilt toddler. In her last completed novel, Austen reforms only the man, and by the end of the novel, Captain Wentworth can acknowledge his own shortcomings. This is where I'm going to get really unpopular, I think. Henry Tilney is another hero who is a type still common today. The man who thinks he is a lot funnier than he actually is. I have often heard it said that Henry Tilney is a favourite Austen hero, and I'm always amazed that anyone could admire him. His jokes and conversation are sexist and patronising, and the way he behaves towards Mrs. Allen at the assembly rooms is unforgivable. Austen does not need to directly label his remarks as sarcasm, as it is bitingly obvious that he is taking advantage of Mrs. Allen's ignorance and good nature when he claims to be an expert on muslins. Catherine recognises that he is being unpleasant to her friend. She thinks of it as strange, but still she finds him irresistible. She's a child. This could be because his competition is John Thorpe, and besides him, most other men look good. Henry very deliberately sets Catherine up to have an unsettling experience at the Abbey, taking 3 pages to outline a plausibly frightening scenario that he knows may easily take place, and describing to her in Gothic terms rooms he is familiar with and that he knows she will come across. After she has fallen into his trap, she realises that it was in a great measure his own doing, for had not the cabinet appeared so exactly to agree with his description of her adventures, she should never have felt the smallest curiosity about it. Of course, when Henry discovers what she's been thinking about the Abbey and his father, he lectures and berates her. He forgets or ignores in his speech that Catherine has no access to male education, to a knowledge of the law, that she has very little social or literary intercourse, or access to newspapers unless they are provided to her by a man. He expects her to have an educated, middle-class man's understanding of society, because that is what he has. This is gaslighting 101, identified as a strategy within abusive relationships in modern times, but very obviously prevalent for over 200 years. Henry is a very unpleasant, superior, sarcastic hero indeed. But most of Austen's men are utterly and sometimes ludicrously unromantic. Mr. Collins, Mr. Bennet, his tastes incline to youth and beauty rather than romance, Wickham, Willoughby, Sir John Middleton, Mr. Woodhouse. How did he ever get married and have 2 daughters? The list goes on and on. One other unromantic hero is Mr. Knightley, whose courtship consists of over 20 years of judgment, correction and chastisement. Emma is significantly younger than him, but the really uncomfortable thing is that he has known her since she was born and has set himself up as a quasi-uncle who now wants to be seen as a suitor. Mr. Knightley disapproves of Emma so often throughout the novel that I gave up counting when I got to 30. And he is quite open about saying that he loves her because she puts up with it. But even clearer in that particular passage is that he feels no shame about how he's treated her. He calls it truth and implies that this is how their relationship will continue. Poor Emma is marrying a more demanding version of her father, and that's a common trope too in art, literature and life. But there are unromantic women as well. Elizabeth Bennet is not particularly romantic. Neither is Fanny Price. For all of her love of poetry, she settles for the least romantic marriage in the novels. Charlotte Lucas openly declares herself not romantic, and she sees courtship and marriage in a very clinical fashion. In spite of this, she engineers a marriage proposal from a man who seems quite frankly to disgust her. This is shocking stuff, without thinking highly of either men or matrimony. Austen says it's possible for a sane and sensible person, even the best friend of a heroine, to not think highly of men or matrimony. Charlotte Lucas is the most modern character in the whole of Austen's writing. Her opinions are recognisably modern. It is her options that dishearten us. She must make do with a situation that just passes as the pleasantest preservative from want. And she is forced by a society that values, like Mr. Bennet, only youth and beauty in women, to feel the good luck of obtaining such a husband as Mr. Collins. Austen is immortal because Charlotte Lucas's predicament is still able to resonate with readers today, because we still live in a world which values women for youth and beauty, and because so many women still feel that their greatest achievement is marriage and children. Austen's men and women are immortal because they face the same issues and the same types of people that we still face today.
Oh boy. Okay, who wants to go first?
Who's going to get their head bit now?
Not by me.
Well, I suppose what I would say was that, you know, someone like Ferrers, you know, there's all this social pressure on him. I mean, and all of them. I mean, there's social pressure which is so different now then to what it is now, and
I only had 20 minutes. I couldn't make
I
the
know. I
excuse.
just felt a little bit. I felt a little bit as though we were looking at people as if they were today, rather than as if they were in that world when.
Indeed.
Yes. So that was.
I'm not claiming to be fair. I wanted to be interesting.
You've succeeded. Look, we can just go and have a cup of tea. I mean, it's 11 o'clock. It is tea time. We can all go and have a cup of tea and just talk about it. I think we're all kind of